my sewing area in my basement, which is currently a huge disaster, and it always is. But today I'm going to show you some basic sewing techniques. So if you want to get into cosplaying and making your own costumes, this is a great way for you to start learning, is these simple and foundation techniques that I'm going to show you. Okay, I have a bunch of scrap fabric that's cut up into squares just so I can show you these basic techniques. And I just grabbed these out of my stash, so definitely not going to miss them. I'm first going to show you how to pin the fabric. You want to line up your edges together, and then I have to take a pin at the top. And one at the bottom. And a couple of them in the middle. So that I have pins along this perpendicularly. I like to do it this way because as you're sewing it makes it easier to take the pin out and still get as close to the pin as possible, because you don't want to sew on your pins. That can break your needle, and you don't want to break needles, and that it can cause injury if it flies into you, and you definitely don't want that to happen. So I'm going to bring this over and sew it. So this is my sewing machine. It's a Brother SE400, which also does embroidery. I got this on Amazon. It has here 67 different stitches that I can use. I don't think I've used all of them yet, but it does all sorts of different stitches, zigzag stitching, blanket stitching, blind hub stitching, and it does a lot of decorative stitching and buttonholes and things like that too. But I'm just going to show you how to do a basic stretch stitch. Now, the machine's already threaded. I would show you how to thread it, but threading is different from machine to machine, so it's best if you read your manual on how to do it. But what I'm going to do is I have my fabric that's pinned, and there are numbers here. There's a 5/8 here, and a 1, and there's a 1/4 inch here. What these are, they help you measure your seam and your seam allowance. Now, a lot of patterns call for a 5/8 inch, unless otherwise noted. When I draft my own patterns, I usually figure out 1/2 inch just because the math is easier. So whatever you do, you just line it up to what you're using. I'm doing basic 5/8 of an inch. And one thing I forgot to show you when I was pinning is I put what would be the right sides together. Now the fabric, you can't really see the difference between the two, but if you have the right sides together and then you open it up, then you see the right side on the outside, and then on the inside is the wrong sides with your raw edges. So what I'm going to do is, this is lifting up and down the foot. You want to lift it up to get your fabric underneath the foot, which is, this is your foot, and then you want to bring it down to put it in place. And the next thing you want to do, that I like to do, is put your needle down, which is this here. I have a button that does it automatically because my machine is computerized, but off to this side here there's also a dial that moves your needle up and down. And I'm going to take out my first pin so I don't sew over it. And then I'm going to sew just a couple stitches. I did not just kick my camera out of the way. Okay. Here we go. So I'm going to push down on the presser foot and then just go a couple stitches. 1, 2, 3, and then stop. And then you want to reverse, which is called back tacking, and what that does is it keeps your threads from unraveling because they kind of wind around each other. Now for mine, I have a button right here that makes it go backwards, and I don't even have to push down the presser foot on my machine, but on some machines you do, and especially in mechanical machines that don't have computers on them, so you would push that reverse button down and then push your pedal down. But for me, I'm just going to hold this down and then stop, and then I'm going to go back over where I back tacked and go for a little bit until I reach this pin and stop. Now, my machine, because it's computerized, the needle will end up in the down position every time. Not all machines can do this. When I take my pins out, I like to make sure my needle is down because that holds the fabric together. So if your machine can't automatically put the pin down, I would move it into place down before you remove the pin. That way your fabric doesn't get all over the place. So then I'm going to keep going and stop. The whole time I am keeping this edge matched up with the 5/8 inch line here. And I'm going to keep going and stop. Take out that last pin. And then I'm going to go until I reach the edge. Stop, back tag again. And then sew over it again. Now, my machine is pretty cool and it'll cut the thread for me automatically, but most machines don't do that. So I'm going to show you what to do next. Is you lift up your needle, either here or there. You lift up your foot, and then you pull out your threads. Pull them out slowly. You don't want to mess anything up with your threading or your tension. Now, most machines have a cutting device on the side, which is most of the times a razor. So you just take it, and then you pull it down, and then you have your seam. So that's how you sew a basic seam with a sewing machine. Okay, so it's all sewn, and you can see my nice seam here. You usually want to use the same color thread that matches your fabric, but for the purposes of demonstration here it's in green, and also because green was the last color I was working on and I really don't want to change the thread head of my machine. So what you want to do now is you want to press open your seam. Now, there's a number of different reasons why you want to do this. One is the heat will in a way bring the thread and the fabric together. And then it also makes the seam lie nice and flat, which you can see here. I can show you another one. See, this one is not pressed open. You can see kind of the bump, and a really definitive seam like that doesn't look as good as this here. So you can't see the seam as much. It doesn't bend into the seam. Now I'm going to show you a really super duper easy way of finishing your raw edges on the inside. Now if you have a serger, use a serger. That's probably the quickest and easiest way to do it. The problem is sergers can be expensive machines costing a few $100s. So if you don't have a serger right now, that's definitely not a big deal. I didn't have one when I first started sewing. But what's a definitely much cheaper option is using these pinking shears. There's a zigzag to them, unlike regular scissors. What you're going to do is take your raw edges, your seam allowance here, and you're going to cut it. And what this does is it puts the fabric at a bias, meaning that the fabric won't fray. See? Zigzags. And that's a finished seam. Easy peasy, huh? This next seam that I'm going to show you is a French seam. Now you want to take your fabric, and when you sew it, before I press open my seam, you want to sew your wrong sides together. Most of the times when you sew, you're sewing your right sides together so that in the finished product, the right sides end up on the outside of the garment. Now this fabric, there's no discernible right side or wrong side to it, but in some fabrics there definitely is. Take for example this super cool Star Wars fabric that I have. This is the right side. So you can see the nice dark green portion of Star Wars, kind of. But if you flip it over, see obviously Star Wars is backwards, and it's a lot not as, crisp and green, and of course backwards. So that one is very easy to tell front and back. Sometimes it's not as easy when you're working with something like a twill that has a weave to it and the weave will go in a certain direction, and if you have a weave going one way and another way on a garment, it looks funny. So that one you definitely want to pay attention. Now, also, as I mentioned before, when you make seams, usually it's at 5/8 of an inch if you're working with a pattern, or 1/2 inch if you're drafting your own patterns. I did this to 3/8 of an inch because I'm going to be sewing this seam twice, and I don't want to take a huge seam allowance. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to press this open like I did before, and now I'm going to trim it. Trim it to about 1/4 to 1/8 of an inch. You can eyeball it. It doesn't have to be exact. You just want it to get close to that seam, but not too close that the seam unravels or anything like that. Oops. Okay, so now that I've trimmed my seam allowance, I'm going to fold it so that the seam is on the outside and the raw edges are on the inside, and then I'm going to press it. Now, this is kind of hard to explain, but what you want your seam to do is go that way, go out. You don't want it going up or going down, you want it going out. So once this is pressed in place, I'm going to sew it again. And this time I'm going to sew it at about 1/4 of an inch, between 1/4 of an inch and 3/8 of an inch, and you want to make sure you keep those raw edges encased inside. You can kind of feel it as you go along with the machine. Now I have my finished French seam. So you can see on the inside now I have a second seam here, and the raw edges are encased inside. It's kind of hard to see, but they're there. And when I flip it open, I just see this one seam, and then it's nice and clean on the inside. Just going to give that a press from the inside, press it open. Now, for a French seam, you want to use it on lightweight fabrics mostly. If you use it on a heavy fabric, it creates a lot of bulk, and that's not usually a good thing. It's used a lot on sheer fabrics because if I were to pink this or overlock stitch this, which is another term for serging, then you would see it because the fabric is sheer. But because it's encased on the inside and there are 4 layers of fabric here, it's a great way of concealing those raw edges when you're using a sheer fabric. So this is definitely something you want to keep in mind if you're working with shears. Now that I've shown you how to do a French seam, I'm going to show you what's called a fake French seam. Now, unlike a regular French seam, I did basic stitch like I showed you before, 5/8 of an inch, right sides together. And I'm going to press open my seam, just like before. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to take 1/2 of it and fold it towards the middle. Put it a little bit in place with my fingers first. It's still a little warm to the touch from the iron, so I'll keep the shape a little bit. And then press. This works really well with the fabric I'm using because it's a cotton. Natural fabrics tend to crease better than polyester or other synthetic fabrics. So this is much easier to do with a fabric that'll give you a crease. Once I have those folded towards the middle, I'm going to lap one on top of the other so that the raw edges are sandwiched in between. And I'm going to give it another press to keep it in place. Now this should look similar to what happened with the French seam, except it's just going about it a different way. Now the raw edges are encased inside, and what I'm going to do, give that another little press, is I'm going to stitch along this seam allowance here that's folded and keep the raw edges inside. This is my final result. You can see the stitched line keeping it inside, so it looks a little bit different than a French seam because you see the 2 stitches here instead of just one. And then when you flip it over, it looks just like your regular seams. So that's a fake French seam. A little bit easier than a French seam in my opinion, but it definitely depends on what type of fabric you're using as well. Alright, the last seam I'm going to show you today is called a flat felled seam. You see this a lot in clothing you buy in the store, and you'll definitely recognize it once I'm finished. So let's do this quickly. Like a French seam, you're going to put wrong sides together. So pretend that this has discernible right and wrong sides, and I sewed the wrong sides together. So what I'm looking at right here is the right side. What you're going to do first is you are going to press it to one side. Doesn't really matter what side you do it to. It's your preference. Now that that's pressed, I'm going to take the lower of the two seam allowances, and I'm going to trim it to about 1/4 or 1/8 of an inch-ish. Doesn't have to be exact, and it also doesn't have to be perfect either. So with the other side, I'm going to fold this over just a smidgen, like 1/4 of an inch, so approximately halfway between that piece of seam allowance and the seam. Turn this towards me actually while I do this. Now when you're working with lightweight fabrics, this is the best way to do it. If you're working with a heavier fabric, I'll show you in a minute what works a little bit better, because this can be kind of tricky with bulky fabrics. Okay, now that you have that folded, you're going to then fold it over like this. Now if you're working with a bulky fabric, you would kind of skip that previous step I did and just fold it onto itself over your trim seam allowance. I'm going to use a little bit of heat there to keep it in place. And then you're going to top stitch along the edge. Top stitch is basically a term for sewing onto the top of a fabric, and it's visible when you're finished. So I'm going to bring this over. Okay, so check it out. I have my flat felled seam. See, don't you kind of recognize this? Like you see it sometimes on jeans and things like that. It's a very sturdy seam, very strong seam, and it also works really well on reversible fabric, reversible garments if you want something that ends up being reversible for whatever reason, because this is the side I just showed you, and then this is the other side. And you could really have it be at either way, depending on what you want the final result to be. If this is when you have the wrong sides together to start, and this is when you have the right sides together to start. So because it's finished on both sides, it works really nicely with reversible garments that you make. Those are the techniques I wanted to show you today. I hope they were helpful and you figured out what I was doing as I walked you through, and they are great places to start if you wanted to get into sewing your own costumes. If you have any questions or if you have any suggestions for future cosplay how-to segments or any segment for the podcast, you can send them to podcast@animecons.com or animecons.tv. I don't know, it'll be right here. Or you could suggest something on our forums, suggest something on our Facebook page or our Twitter page, and we hope to bring you more cosplay how-tos in the future. But if you have a question in the meantime, post on our forums. All of us cosplay on the podcast, some of us in different places than others. Of course, Sketch is good at props, and Doug is in the 501st, so knows a lot about how to do armor, is learning a lot about armor, and you know, Patrick's done some really cool mascot costumes, and Shiv and Gail are both awesome at sewing as well. So if you have a question, just let us know and we'd be happy to answer it. Till then, see you next time.